Figure we'll get started. How's that sound? So we've got a lot of people on this video, and I'm really excited about that. And I assume it's because of the topic. The topic is a little hotly debated topic. What we've seen recently, in the last 12 months, is that we've tried to hold on to how we've always done business, even at our own detriment. So historically, the listing agent would sign a listing agreement and it would have a co-broke fee in it. In fact, our listing agreements now still have those same terms. It has an amount that would be offered to another agent if they were to bring a buyer. So that really hasn't changed, but everything else did change. We're not able to put it on MLS. We're not able to disclose how much we're offering unless it's privately. So about a year ago when this all came out, I kind of hypothesized and said, I think that we'll have an easier time if we really just focus on negotiating the listing agent compensation and leave the buyer agent compensation to be determined. And I don't think many people listened to me, except for maybe one or two. One or two people may have brought that up because it is very different. And I didn't think it would happen overnight, but I do think it is happening. It is happening. So I will give you examples of what I'm seeing and kind of what the downsides are with this process, how you do it well, when you shouldn't do it, and why it could be a problem. So here's the thing. So someone says they did listen to me. I love that. And keep in mind, this is not for everybody. You have to know yourself. You have to know your delivery. You have to know how easily you can present this. You have to know your strength with your customer, your seller, your buyer. All these things are very, very relevant. And it's very similar to other parts of real estate where I say context is everything. Context is everything when it comes to this. So that's my disclaimer. Know yourself, know your business, know your customer before deciding which one to do. So there is a good argument to not negotiate for the listing or anything beyond just the listing side compensation. So let me pull up a sales contract or a listing contract. I guess I have to log in. That would be helpful. Share. So I always go to Neighbor, and I've brought this up before. When all the changes were going on, all the different forms were happening, Neighbor had them first, and then they would slowly disseminate to app files and Simplifile and other things like that. So if you're worried about whether you have the most recent form, go right to Neighbor. You can't do that necessarily with Farbar, but you can go to your trusted vendor there. But for Neighbor especially, I think this is a great way to do it. So we're going to go look at the listing agreement. Oh, I did the rental one, of course. Make sure. I hope I'm still sharing the right form. One of these days I'll actually get good at this. All right. So here's our listing agreement. This is the January 1, 2025 listing agreement. And if we go all the way down to line 126, we talk about the amount being paid to in total compensation. So this is the compensation. Let me zoom in so we can see it better. Line 126, total compensation. So line 128, you would put your full amount. You'd put the full amount when you consider how much it would be paid to the listing agent and how much would be paid to the selling agent or the buyer's agent. And then if you go further down, it says seller elects the following. So either elects to permit broker to offer a share of the portion of compensation with the buyer's broker who has procured a buyer. And then you would put the amount. So historically, we would always put maybe a split of some sort. If it was 5% on one, it would be 2.5 on the other. If it was 6, it'd be 3. It could be, it could be a 6 of total and only 2 to the buyer agent or only 2 to the listing agent. And this is how you would always work it. But what I will point out is line 145 does not elect to permit broker to offer a portion of compensation to procuring buyer's broker. We are seeing this happen more and more, where they just say the total compensation up in line 128 would be 3%. And then the following amount down here, we would just say does not elect. And so here's the first benefit. Here's our pro. And let me see, I can't get this thing to follow me, but if you start with that, the pro of that is that the seller is only talking about that your fee. We're not talking about what attorney they're going to use and how much they're going to offer on the other agent and how much they're going to offer in concessions or repairs. We're just talking about what is in front of us. You, the listing agent. Your job is to get that listing, to secure it, to convince your seller to price it appropriately and to price and to set the property appropriately. And we're focused on that. Now, it is harder to then take the next step and negotiate for line 120 or 139, where the amount that you're sending to the buyer's agent or offering to a buyer's agent, going that extra effort to ensure that the buyer's agent is taken care of, that's extra effort. It just is. So if you have a seller who's already being difficult, they're being difficult on price, they're being difficult on your fee, on everything else, and maybe they don't know you that well, and this was just the first introduction, maybe it's easier to only talk about your listing side. That's the idea. It's easier. But there's another pro. All right, so we do that. Let's say we talk about 3%. That's how much I'm going to charge. And I tell you that when we see other buyer offers, they're going to ask for compensation. We'll have to see what that is based on the offer that they bring. All right, we're going to look at it in whole. We're not going to negotiate the amount now. We're going to see how much they're offering and how much they're asking in compensation. If you have a seller that understands that, you're winning. You're doing really, really well. And I'll tell you why. Because it's possible that you were going to negotiate 3 and 3, and the buyer's agent who comes to you only wants 2.5. That's all it said on their buyer broker agreement. Maybe they even only had less. Maybe they had 2. Maybe they had less than that. Who knows? Maybe they had more. But why negotiate up front if you don't know what the buyer's agent has agreed to accept? You just don't know. So leave that blank and have the other agent ask for it in their offer. All right, sounds reasonable, right? That's why we would do that. But obviously you guys can see there are some challenges here. The first challenge we're running into, at least that I thought of, was that how many sellers will truly understand what you're talking about? How many sellers will misinterpret this communication, misinterpret how this is going to work, and assume that they're only paying your percentage for compensation? A lot of them. And that's really the biggest concern in my mind. There are probably 2 concerns. That's one of the biggest concerns. How many agents or how many sellers will misinterpret this and assume that they were only paying your fee and never even accounting for a buyer agent fee as well? That would be, a shot out of left field. The seller never saw it coming, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. Why do I have to pay their fee as well? That's a risk. I think you can mitigate that risk by talking to the seller, providing a seller net sheet, and kind of going through, hey, if the buyer brings an agent, they're likely going to ask for something similar to what I'm charging. So based on that, here's what the net would be on the different price points. And you just have a different list, a different set of lists. You have, if you're selling it for 600, 575, 565, 550, anywhere from 2% up to 3% to 4%, whatever it may be. Here's what your net would be. Here's what we're really talking about. But if you have a seller that just isn't getting it, and this is where we have to be very good listeners. If you have a seller that doesn't get it, I think this is not something you should use. they need to agree to pay the full compensation upfront, both sides, so that they're not confused by their total cost. So we have to avoid confusion. If we can get over that hump, I still think we should move forward. I still think this is a great option. Next issue that I see, and this is the one that I really misdiagnosed initially, is that I think other agents could be offended by your answer. So if we go back, the agent, they're interested in, the buyer's interested in your house and the property. They do a walkthrough and they just call you and they ask you, hey, they really liked it. What are you offering for compensation? If you say nothing, you say nothing, we're not offering anything. I have seen that go poorly. I really have. I've seen it go poorly. The buyer's agent feels like they're being cut out of the deal. They feel like they're going to have to go back to their buyer to get paid. And, why did I even show this? This is just obnoxious. This is realtor on realtor crime. Like, what are we doing here? The point of this video is to tell you that none of those things are happening. That's not what's happening. What is happening is that they're allowing you to dictate what you charge. So if you're the buyer's agent and someone says, we don't have a specific amount listed in the listing agreement, in your offer, request that the seller pay you your fee. Just put it in your offer. And that's really as simple as it gets. Include it in your offer. You can ask for whatever you want, include it in your offer. You like that? Is that delivered correctly? Are you going to stumble on your words as the listing agent? Are you going to upset the buyer's agent? Is this really going to be problematic? It could be problematic, right? Not everyone can communicate this clearly, but I have seen it done really, really well. And done really well by really great agents. I've also seen it done poorly, and the revolt that comes from a poorly worded response is pretty bad. Everyone gets thrown under the bus. We saw emails over the last 7 days where a buyer's agent felt disrespected, just was, what is this world coming to? I don't work for free type thing. Or, I'm sure the listing agent's getting paid. Why am I not getting paid? My job here today is to tell you that is not the correct response. The correct response is, all right, I signed a buyer broker agreement with my buyer at 3%. That's what I'm going to ask for. Now, how do I do it? How do I do it? So Kim asks, so many brokers are teaching realtors to have seller pay a co-broke. Yes, that is true. So there are a lot of brokers, especially more of the traditional brokerages, the bigger brokerages, the big name brokerage. They have certain policies that they very much try to guide how this business is going to work. They will say, we charge this, and we always make sure there's a co-broke. We always. But that's not the rule. As you guys know, compensation is not set by law and is fully negotiable. Not set by law is fully negotiable. So they train to say you have to put it in these boxes. But there are plenty of brokerages, and it would be perfectly legal to not have a co-broke. Absolutely. So keep that in mind. Thank you, Kim. It's really good feedback. Tom Cruise asks, how about adding to the listing agreement note, buyer will negotiate buyer agent's commission upon offer? I like that. I like that. I think that you're really just trying to educate your customer. In this case, you're educating the seller that there's more than just my fee, possibly. Right? That's what you're wanting to do. You want to clarify, because the worst that could happen is you get an offer, they're asking for another 3% to pay the buyer's broker, and your seller flips out. Oh my gosh, you didn't tell me this. And like he said, if you can point to the listing agreement that says, no, we talked about this, and it's in the listing agreement, that you should expect the buyer broker compensation to be included as well. Now, we've talked about the initial really good reason to do this is The first reason to do it would be that your listing appointment should go smoother because you're only negotiating your compensation. In fact, you should be able to charge even more, hopefully. There's a silver lining, is that if you're negotiating on 5% or 6%, the seller's going to try and beat you up down to 5%, right? Maybe they beat you up down to 4%. Whereas if you're just negotiating your compensation, start at 3. It's already less intimidating for the seller. So maybe you go down to 2.5, maybe you don't, maybe it's 3, maybe that's the cost, maybe that's what you charge. But it should make your listing appointments simpler. Now, let's say you and the seller are on the best of terms, and you know that the seller is going to hire you. You know that the seller is going to hire you. So you don't play these games, right? You don't want to do that. There is a reason you would still do this. There's still one reason, and I really like this reason. When you put it on the market, someone shows interest, you tell them to include it in their offer, that the seller will pay it, please include it in your offer, and they only ask for 2. Who makes the difference? The seller. The seller saved money in that case. Now, the listing agent and the seller are on the same page. They are both motivated towards the same thing, maximizing the return to the seller. Because the listing agent's compensation is set by their listing agreement. The buyer broker compensation is set with their buyer, and they're going to include it in their offer. If you had, if your listing agreement had said 3 and you answered 3, the buyer agent's going to ask for 3. But if the listing agreement says nothing, and you tell them that the listing agreement doesn't say anything but to include it, maybe they only ask for 2.5 because that's what their buyer agreement said. I like that. I really like it. But please be careful. Really, please be careful. You have to deliver this correctly. And if you can't deliver it correctly, stay away from it. If this is something that you'll struggle with, don't do it. If it's easier for you just to negotiate both sides up front, and then, you feel like the other agents are going to appreciate that more, do it, please. This is tricky. And I don't know if this will ever catch on masse, but I will tell you really good agents are doing this. Really good agents are doing it. Krista asks, what is the suggested language if you're not offering a co-broke to add in the listing so you can refer back to it? I think you could do something really simple. I think you could say, seller acknowledges that it may be asked to pay buyer broker compensation in addition to the compensation listed herein. So seller acknowledges that it may be asked or is likely going to also pay the buyer broker compensation as included in any offer it receives. Something like that. Nothing too crazy. You're just trying to do a disclaimer. It doesn't have to be in the listing agreement. It could also just be in an email. So a lot of times what we like to propose is we talk to you on the phone, we talk to you in person, and then we go home, we get on our computer, and we send an email. Great talking with you today. Just as a follow-up, here's some high points I want to hit. We didn't include any co-broke fees to a buyer's agent. However, you should still expect to receive a request to pay that equal to or less than what I'm charging you. Something like that. I think that would be good. I think that would be really great. And then here are the other points. Someone else asked, what is the best way for the buyer's agent to ask for compensation in the offer? Should I just put it in the other terms and conditions? Oh, I'm so sorry. I should have removed the screen share. So there is an addendum that Nabor has that I really like. And we actually talked about it a bit last week, but we were a little confusing with it. And for that reason, I apologize. Let me see if I can show. All right, so here's the addendum that Nabor has. And I like this one. It says the contract is contingent upon seller delivering to buyer not later than 3 days after the effective date of the contract a copy of a binding agreement establishing the compensation to be paid by buyer's broker. In this, let's say in my scenario, the listing agent said we did not include it. However, you should include it in your offer. You would just check this box, seller agreeing to pay buyer's broker at closing, and put the amount that you're charging. That's what you would do. And you'd have the seller would sign it as part of the offer, so would the buyer. And then you'd follow up. But I did confirm this. Dad, I noticed you're on the video. I did confirm this, that after you sign this, you follow it up with a broker compensation agreement. So that's
the agreement, Christian, or that other form you were referring to?
What was that, Dad?
You give them a copy of your buyer compensation agreement, or you give them that other form you referred to last week, showing the amount.
The broker compensation agreement.
Okay.
So there's a broker compensation agreement. It would be seller to buyer's broker. That's the one. And Farbar has the same thing. Seller to buyer's broker, put the amount. They would sign that. So
Yeah, I would also say, Christian, make sure they use the right one.
yeah. Tell me about that, Mike. Are you seeing that a lot?
Yeah, sometimes agents, the problem is the word brokers in a lot of these different forms, and that creates confusion. So it's important because if the seller is not offering compensation to the buyer's broker and you use the broker's compensation agreement, yeah, from the listing broker to the buyer's broker, well, that doesn't help you.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a problem for if the listing broker somehow signs it. I mean, that creates an interesting situation. So make sure you use the right one there. And I thought that the broker compensation agreement, going from seller to the buyer's broker was strictly for a FSBO, but it really isn't. It could be a FSBO or a situation where the seller is not offering compensation initially.
Or they didn't offer enough. So this is a little weird, but you could have a listing agreement that's offering 2, but the buyer agent negotiates for an extra 1. That would have to come from the seller. So you'd have 2 coming from the listing agent and 1 coming from the seller. Probably pretty unlikely. Probably not happening very often, but it's possible. In fact, Sigrid makes a really great point. When I told the buyer agent that a buyer's broker compensation was 2.5, he responded, "I will not negotiate my compensation, which is 3%." So, this cuts both ways. If you put a number in your listing agreement and the other agent isn't happy with it, they get upset with you anyways. So why put yourself through that? Don't list anything and say, I don't know what you negotiated with your buyer. However, please include it in your offer, and my seller will pay it. Something that simple, very simple.
Additional point, Christian, how you handle it, I agree with you, is critically important because it sets the tone for the whole closing transaction. I mean, if you're fighting like hell in the beginning, you're going to fight like hell over everything. Sort of like a seller's disclosure. If you do that wrong, you're arguing over things, the whole deal is going to go south.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Something where the seller acknowledges that he may be asked to pay buyer broker compensation, or he's open to buyer broker compensation, sets a positive tone. Plus, you're making the other guy go first. You never want to go against yourself, like you pointed out.
And it's kind of the win is you make the buyer present it. Maybe they're going to offer what you were going, or ask for what you were offering anyways. Maybe they're asking for more than you would have offered. But let them make the first move. Let them negotiate, and whatever savings there might be, the seller would benefit from that. Someone asked for me to clarify what form to include in your offer. This is the form: addendum to sales contract compensation. This is the form I want you to use. This is not the only way to do it, but it's really the only way that I like to do it. I would include this form, addendum to sales contract, and then in your sales contract, there's a box. There's a box that you would check in the 500 lines, 570 something, that says, compensation. You check that box, you include this addendum with it, and you have your buyer sign it, basically stating, we're asking that the seller pay the buyer's broker a certain percentage. This is the form I want you to use. Now, the other way that I have seen it done is that in other terms and conditions or somewhere else in the sales contract, you simply specify seller shall pay buyer's broker, and list the name, compensation of blank. You could do it that simply. You could even borrow language from this. Um, Now, you wouldn't need this if the broker compensation agreement was signed in advance of your offer. So if 2 days before you made your offer, the listing agent sent you a broker compensation agreement at a certain percent, you wouldn't need to reference any compensation in the sales contract. This would only be if you don't know what the seller has agreed to. You don't know what the listing agent's agreed to, and you want to make sure your deal is contingent upon them doing that. We have some more questions. This is great. I feel like only negotiating the listing side compensation, especially at 3%, is only a useful tool if your seller is willing to pay up to 6% total. Would you agree? Otherwise, it's in their best interest to just agree to a 5% total compensation if that's the number they don't want to go above. I could see it both ways, Mike. I really could. I see your point. So Mike's point is if you know your seller's limitations on what they're willing to accept or offer, why wouldn't you just negotiate that up front and have an answer when the buyer broker asks? Yeah, maybe. I can see that. I can. That takes off the table one of the pros of maybe saving the seller a little bit of money, right? It does. It takes that off the table. But it's there still is that benefit to you as the listing agent that you don't have to negotiate at the full 5. You could just do yours. Maybe you could get 3 instead of 2.5. But it's a good point, Mike. And I do expect people to have an opinion on this. And it's not supposed to align with mine. This is just another way to think about it. So if you've thought about this, you've listened to me or anyone else that talks about it, and you decide this isn't for you, that's great. I think that's a good way to do it. That's how you should practice. But if you do all that research and you decide this really is something you want to try, you now have some of that information.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Nick made the point in an email earlier this week that his clients just deal with net figures, sellers, buyers, and they make the decisions based on that, which is what it's been since I've started doing this. And to me, it feels a little bit like the tail wagging the dog here. If you get somebody too hung up on offering buyer broker compensation, the obvious fix is to offer 3% less or whatever your compensation would be, which is what people did 5 years ago or 6 years. It affects the price. People look at how much they're going to walk away from the closing table with, or how much they're going to have to offer in total, including their closing costs. So, there's more than one way to skin a cat in this situation.
There really is, and context is very, very important. You may not have the right seller for this. You may not have the right property for this. If you have a lower end property, then you kind of know what the compensations are going to be. You really do. Mike brings up a really good point, and I have a solution for him. He says, if writing an offer on your own listing and your seller is already offering buyer agent compensation, are any forms required with the offer regards to compensation? A lot of buyers are now contacting the listing agents directly since new changes in August. Yes, absolutely, Mike. This is a huge windfall for listing agents, this whole NAR settlement thing. It really is. I see it a couple of different ways. I think that I think it would be fine. Well, let me start simply. You would need a buyer broker agreement with that buyer. You can let them see the house, you can tour them around without a buyer broker agreement because you are the listing agent. But once that buyer wants to make an offer and asks you to help them do that, you now need a buyer broker agreement. So you go to the buyer broker agreement, your listing agreement says how much is being offered to a buyer side. Ideally, you would put that same amount in your buyer broker agreement. So if it was, 5% total and half of it's being shared to the buyer broker, then you would put that amount, that half amount on the buyer broker agreement. However, sometimes you want that buyer to work with you directly. You don't want to turn them away. You don't want to scare them by having a number in that buyer broker agreement. Now, first thing first, I want you to confirm with your broker what the policies are in this scenario. That's the simple answer. I have an opinion, but you want to confirm with your broker that you'll be okay. I believe you could sign a buyer broker agreement at 0% because you're going to earn the total compensation as the listing agent. That's what your listing agreement says, that it's 5% total. And that's what you would earn because you're not sharing anything with the buyer agent, which is technically you. However, I did text language that I think makes it a little bit cleaner. And the brokers seem to like it a lot better. So it says, if agent of such and such brokerage is the transaction broker for both the buyer and the seller, compensation shall be amended as follows. Total compensation shall be blank of the purchase price, section K1, and compensation to the buyer's broker shall be 0, section K2D. So just to reiterate what that means is that if you become the agent on both sides, the listing agreement gets modified and has 0 split to the buyer broker. And it's all just compensation that the listing agent would earn. And that way you could easily put 0% on your BBA and you could keep your listing agreement and you wouldn't have to overcomplicate it. If you had this in your listing agreement, I think you'd be fine to sign a BBA at 0. So Mike, I hope that answers your question. That would be the only thing you would need to have signed on a deal like that. Other than maybe explaining it to your buyer and seller how it will work. Does that make sense, Dad?
Yeah, there was a Nabor video on this, Sean Gary and Marcy. I think it was on loss prevention or something along those lines. And I think halfway through it, they got into that issue and they said it was perfectly fine. And the FAR forms have a language in the footnotes or the fine print that whatever, if it's your listing, whatever you get paid by the selling agent is independent of what you get in the buyer broker agreement. You can actually get in total more than what is in the buyer broker agreement without there being a violation, because those are for services to the seller, not for services to the buyer.
Yep, exactly. So you can also use this if you started at that lower number just for yourself. You could modify this language and say, you could use this language to say, if I end up doing both sides, I'm going to charge X% more to do both sides. So you, instead of coming down, so a lot of agents, they'll say, all right, I'm charging 6, but if I do both sides, I'll do it for 5 or whatever the number is. You could say I charge 3, but if I do both sides, I charge 5.
You're doing more work.
You're doing more work. And so basically you use the same language saying that if you are the only agent on the deal, then the total compensation changes to this new number. You could do it that way too.
It's reasonable. You're doing more work.
And, and Tom follows up, seller says we'll accept the offer, but we won't pay broker compensation. The deal probably falls apart, right? That's the reality.
That's a counteroffer.
Yeah, that's a counter offer. So you can't sign that. You basically cross out the addendum, you'd counter back to the buyer. And now the buyer has to make a determination. Okay, we're 2% off, we're 3% off based on compensation. It does put some pressure on the realtors to make a deal go through. That's for sure. But that's kind of been the age-old thing too. I mean, the agents are always looked to for being the solutions. So, and then Tom says, now the buyer wants to lower the offer and the seller says, no, yeah, you're 3% off in that scenario. And that is actually really, really common. That happens a lot, not just because of this particular issue, but we're off a little bit. We're off on price. And then someone asked, why is the addendum better than other terms and conditions? It seems easier and doesn't require the seller's broker to follow up with additional terms. Dad, do you mind taking the reins for just a second? I gotta take a phone call real quick.
Yeah. I would put them both at not that one is better or not. One's approved by Nabor, but I think they're both fine. They both work, honestly. So
I think with the other terms and conditions, Dad, it's easy to mess it up, right?
Well, the agent's drafting it, and if you make a mistake, then you're out of luck. The form makes it bulletproof. Yeah. And putting it in context, when you make an offer, typically your buyer is making a lower offer than what the seller is asking. So if they just ratchet it down 2 or 3%, that leaves them a little buffer. And you explain it to them, this, we're giving you a little buffer in case the seller is difficult about paying buyer broker compensation.
Yeah.
We're
I
baking it
did
in.
talk with someone down at Nabor, and the mindset of why they require these forms and really discourage the other terms and conditions is they want a contract between the seller and the buyer's agent where they've agreed to compensation. Because if you include it in the offer and the seller signs it, the buyer broker hasn't signed it. You know, they might be a beneficiary, a third party beneficiary of the contract, but
Right,
they
right.
didn't agree to that number. And so there's almost like a disconnect or you know, there's no mutuality of agreements in that sense. So whether that holds any water or not, that was their reason for requiring something between the seller and buyer broker specifically. That was it. So maybe that would never come to fruition. Maybe you wouldn't have that issue. Maybe it's easier just to do that form in the other terms and condition. But in that one-off scenario where the seller is really cute, that could be a problem. That could be a problem.
You still have to read the room. You're still going to come in low. There's going to be give and take. And they're still going to be doing net sheets when this is all said and done. So, it's just a layer in between all that.
Yeah, Mike, what are you seeing this week? Anything crazy? Anything you read that you really like right now?
Yeah, I actually read an interesting article, and the gist of it was where are baby boomers moving to? And they did an analysis of 267 cities in the country, and 10 of the top 20 were in Florida. And actually, number two on the list was Cape Coral, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
But
The Cape.
a breakdown of the top 20, 10 of them were in Florida. Only one was in California, which was number 20 on the list. Three of them were Arizona, two were Nevada, and then North Carolina, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Texas each got one. So Florida is well positioned. And I noticed of the 10 in Florida, I do think some people made the top 20 based on affordability, price
Yeah,
points.
yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
So, because I noticed the California one was some town that, most people hadn't even heard of. So I think affordability is more and more an issue these days. But I thought that was interesting because we all know that the baby boomers have a lot of equity for the ones that own
Mhm.
homes build up. So where are they going? And I think Florida, with the no state tax and some of the other benefits, is well positioned for the next 10 years.
That's great. I love it. I love that. Love to hear that. Yeah, we're very blessed. We're very lucky. You know, look at today. It was, you know, it'll be 70 degrees and sunny, so we'll take it. It's beautiful. All right, so we have to finish up the video. Learn one thing. Here's the learn one thing. Don't get frustrated when a listing agent says that they're not offering compensation. Don't get frustrated. That gives you an opportunity to dictate how much you're getting paid. That's what that is. So if they're not giving you any guide rails on what that's going to be, include it based on your buyer broker agreement. Use the addendum, specify it, and if the deal doesn't work because you're half a point off, that's for you and your buyer to decide what to do. And even from that, I did get the question, what do I do if we're, you know, half a point off or a whole point off? You can ask the seller or the buyer to make up the difference based on your buyer broker agreement. That's what they're obligated to do. Or you can lower your fee, or you can meet in the middle, or you can go back to the seller and ask for more.
Hey, Chris, I would do both. I'd offer a tiny bit less and make it part of the offer so that you have room to give back so the other side feels like they won something.
Yep, leave a little something in it for everybody. All right, well, there's your learn one thing. Thank you guys for joining. I hope that was helpful. Let me know how it goes. Let me know if you use it. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Chris.